So, good morning, everyone. Very much welcome to the next Flash Friday in the first week of June. We're very much looking forward to take you through the news today from a perspective of Holland FinTech, and of course, hopefully enlighten you a little bit about the developments in the FinTech field in general. And of course, I'm not going to do that by myself. My name is Ginsel for the new viewers, but I've got a very distinguished guest, and that is Jan van Vonno from Tink. Jan, welcome very much to this to the show this morning. Very grateful that you could join.
Thank you, Don. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great. Of course, we're still in the remote situation due to Corona, so Jan and I have to do this conversation over distance, but I hope it will be an engaging talk anyway with you. We've got a couple of attendees via Zoom, as well as that we're being broadcasted live, in any case, on YouTube. So if you're in the Zoom and you have any questions for Jan or for me, please type them in the Q&A box so we're able to look at your questions and figure out how to weave them into our story. Yeah, it's still crazy times. I think due to Corona, developments in the markets are really funny. We see stock markets going sky high. We see the budgets from governments also going sky high with regard to the support measures that they're willing to put towards the economy. And in the meanwhile, it seems that FinTech is actually going quite strong at the moment. And from that perspective, it's really great to have Tink, a major player in the open banking in Europe, at the table. And Jan, I think as the head of their research, I think you've got a really nice insights about developments, especially on open banking from a European perspective. Could you tell us a little bit about Tink as a background?
Sure. Let me first briefly introduce my role. So as Don said, I'm the research director at Tink, which means that I get to basically help us internally understand where the market is heading, how the market is moving, support our marketing organization with the communication, and of course help our prospects and customers understand how open banking is changing the nature of the financial services industry. And so what Tink is an open banking technology provider established in 2012. And what we're providing is what we say like the rails and brains of open banking. The rails being account information services and payment initiation services. We're a licensed third-party provider under the Swedish financial institutions. So in Dutch, they would say license number 7 and license type 8, or license type 7 and type 8. And we also provide the brains for open banking, meaning that we enrich data and we provide the tools that developers and financial institutions can use in order to create really intuitive apps and analytics. So we're about 300 people, and I think we've captured just over 170 million euros in VC funding so far. So we're on a right trajectory.
Yeah, that's quite a nice amount, especially in the European perspective, because generally the funding rounds aren't so generous here as they are, for example, in the US. So I think that's definitely a really nice accomplishment. And of course, there's a really big potential there in open banking as we see it. And you seem to be very nicely positioned for that. So one question I think is, for example, I hear a lot of talk of people that are still quite worried about the privacy aspects of data sharing around open banking. That must be one of your USPs, that you actually just take proper care of people's data under GDPR. How does that work? Can you say something about that?
Sure. I mean, so first of all, I think PSD2 is an amazing piece of legislation because one thing I think a lot of people are not aware of is that open banking, the notion of open banking, has existed for over a decade. I mean, Tink was founded back in 2012, and back in the day, Tink was able to serve over 500,000 Swedish consumers by helping them gain better control over the finances, by aggregating all their different bank accounts, not only payment accounts, but also investment accounts and mortgages, all within a single app. I mean, since then, the market has moved along, and Tink has become more a platform that wants to enable other third parties to do the same, to create value. But in the meantime, PSD2 has come along and said, hey, this is actually really interesting. These companies such as Tink, they're operating outside the scope of the legislation. Let's make sure that we include them within our scope of regulation, so that we do proper due diligence, and that they have to sort of align with the requirements and the regulations that we set for not only larger financial institutions and big banks, but also for these innovative players in the market. So thanks to PSD2, companies can now be licensed in order to be able to, authorized to hold and manage data on behalf of customers.
Do you think that actually then, in the end, given the discussions about privacy in Europe, that it puts the financial industry in quite a privileged position, actually, because we might actually be used to much stronger positioning around dealing with data, how to share it, how to guard it, how to keep it private?
So I think, GDPR itself is already an amazing piece of legislation, and I'm happy to see that jurisdictions all over the world are now following suit in terms of trying to put in place legislation that it gives the consumer rights over their own data. I think one of the important shifts that we're seeing in the financial services industry is that shift where looking at the old model, where the assumption was a monolithic relationship between customer and financial institution. And in that world, financial institutions have owned the data. It was their data, and they owned the infrastructure. Now with GDPR and PSD2 and many of the other data rights legislations all over the world, we're now seeing that the customer, be it a consumer or a business, is regaining control over that data and can authorize third parties in order to provide more relevant, valuable, affordable services. So I think that's a move that we're seeing all over the world. And in Europe, Europe is now clearly pioneers in terms of taking a stab at the open banking movements. But we're seeing in other continents in the world, in Australia, in South America, Latin America, even in the MEA countries, we're seeing basically governments stepping up and saying, this is actually a movement that we want to endorse, and we want to make sure that the right legislation is put in place for it.
Yeah, great, thanks. So also, I think yesterday you published a blog about some piece that came out from the EBA, right? So that they actually looked again at how the implementation of PSD2 is working out and where some of the bottlenecks are. It's quite interesting to see that they're at least opening up to sort of revise the way they've set it up. How do you see this as what kind of step is this now towards actually, and what else is there still to do to actually fully come to an open banking environment that we think would be beneficial for everyone?
Interesting. So so first of all, I think few people realize, but PSD2 stands for the Revised Payment Services Directive. So it's a directive that was actually published in 2015, enforced in 2016. Most member states need to enforce it within 2 years, so 2018. But it was a directive, meaning that every member state, every EU country was able to implement the regulation basically according to their own interpretation, more or less. I mean, it's not as flexible as they make it seem, but what you have is different interpretations across Europe. And now what the EBA has done is it has helped sort of harmonize the interpretation by publishing an opinion on what would qualify as an obstacle in a PSD2 API. And I think this is going to help streamline the ecosystem across Europe, because still today we see a lot of fragmentation in the quality and the performance and the data parity and the user experience of PSD2 APIs across Europe. And if we just look at one of the markets where they have one of the most vibrant ecosystems for open banking, that's the UK. In the UK, the 9 largest banks have needed to align with the data standard for open banking, and we see over half of all licensed TPPs are come from the UK alone, and that's a market where the APIs are most predictable and most stable overall. So if you compare that to every other market, so I think this is an important piece of important publication by the EBA that hopefully will allow us to create in the rest of Europe a similar stable environment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice that the European Banking Authority finally, at least, is looking into that, because I think indeed the fragmentation in Europe becomes very obvious if you look at how PSD2 is being implemented, and it puts up quite a big growth hurdle, I think, for everyone who wants to work with it. Okay, yes, and so what do you think are actually sort of which markets? I think you mentioned a couple just before, like Australia, South America, for example. Which markets do you think we should be looking at as well? Because some are actually way ahead of Europe, right? So you named the UK is basically leading the example in Europe. But should we also look at, for example, what Australia is doing? Are you expecting things to move in that direction there here as well?
Yeah, so I think the Australian market, if we're just talking about open banking here, I think the Australian market has taken a really interesting angle. So last year in February, they published the Consumer Data Rights Act, it's basically GDPR on steroids. In other words, it gives consumers the right to recall or call on information, their data, from whatever service provider in whatever industry. And the Australian ACCC is going to be rolling out a plan to make sure that in every industry there are going to be a set of standards to basically create an ecosystem for innovation. And the first industry that they've picked out is the financial industry, primarily following the example of the UK government. So I think that's going to be an interesting market, but we're already seeing that they've already postponed or delayed the deadlines for the testing environments. They've already postponed the delays for the providing of transaction data, and my understanding is that they're now revising pieces of that legislation to also include payments as part of that sort of regulation. So not just the transfer of data and transaction information, but also to enable payment initiation as part of it. But I think one of the markets that I'm most interested in is the Brazilian market. Just earlier this year, they released basically the final draft of a new piece of legislation, and it basically means that the full implementation of open banking in Brazil is going to be ready by, I think, Q4, start of Q4, end of Q3 of 2021, October 2021. So it's going to be it's going to be quite exciting to see one of these emerging economies embrace open banking and allow other parts of the population get access to financial services in an affordable way.
Yeah, I think it's also especially funny that you mentioned Brazil, because I think you see that there's a lot of news coming from that area. You've got, of course, Nubank, which is growing like crazy, the neobank that's based there. We've got news from Belvo here that raised money. And so you see that it seems like the fintech industry is very vibrant at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, you have to imagine. I think, if you're looking at some of the numbers, you have the highest internet penetration via mobile phones. Only 3% of the population has access to or qualifies to get a mortgage. You have a huge part of that population that is looking for digital financial services and is looking to be able to get access to capital in a way that doesn't require them to go into the cities and queue up for an hour, because that's really the scenario that you end up with. Actually, earlier this year, before the corona surge around the world, I had the opportunity to travel through South America, and I took pictures for my colleagues just to show, this is what banking looks like in South America. And you see huge queues. People have to wait in line for hours in order to either withdraw cash or make a deposit or request a loan. And I think open banking, especially in these types of emerging economies, are going to make a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to see how that's actually helping to include a larger portion of the population and enable them to actually interact with finance from that perspective. Cool. And so if we would actually take that back to sort of the European perspective, right? So I think, hopefully Europe is really able to smoothen out the wrinkles in the carpet to really make PSD2 and open banking work to a larger extent. Where do you think things might be heading from perspective? I mean, there's a lot of debate as well whether the end parties that will benefit from this one could be fintech companies. It could also be the banks themselves that find out ways to deal with the data. But we, of course, have also these always scary third parties, very often referred to as big tech firms, right? So you've got these dominant internet players that are also keen to get their hands on payment data. Where do you see that going, and where do you think that might bring the play for fintech?
So for the European market specifically?
Yep.
So I think the European market is a very fragmented market. I mean, if you just look at credit institutions across the EU, the EBF, the European Banking Federation, I think they're counting 5,500 independent credit institutions in Europe, and that shows already that the nature of the financial industry in Europe is quite competitive. This differs per country. In every country, you have some incumbents that are operating in quite a comfortable position. And I think one of the things that the European Union is doing with PSD2 and with some of the sort of the directives that they released around credit, so the mortgage directive and the consumer credit directive, is to enable these financial institutions, these 5,500 credit institutions, to start competing cross-border within the EU as well. And actually, open banking is going to play an important part of enabling that competition. So I think within that type of ecosystem, a big dominant player like one of the GAFAs, it wouldn't really make sense for them, or there wouldn't be a lot of direct value for them to move into the market as a credit institution. What we're seeing in the US, what we're seeing in Mexico, what we're seeing in now Europe as well, are going to be partnerships between Apple and Goldman Sachs, between Google and Citibank. And these types of partnerships are going to allow, slowly these markets move into, closer and closer to the consumer. And don't forget, they're already part of the consumer payment sort of value chain. In most cases, iPhone users already use Apple Pay, and Google users or Android users will be using, the Google Wallet more and more over the next coming years. So they're really quite close to the consumer today. Yeah.
And how should we see your partnership with PayPal in that light, basically? Is it also to get closer to the consumer from that perspective?
Well, what we're doing with them, so first of all, so we made an announcement yesterday, or was it 2 days ago, that PayPal has, we've expanded our partnership with PayPal. So so we're now operating with, really very nice for us. So we're going to be working with PayPal across Europe, and we've also announced another investment by PayPal into Tink. And what we're doing with PayPal is, I can't go into details, unfortunately, but we're trying to help them further mature their offerings in the markets. They're of course in the payment space. And we want to make sure that that going forward, that they can successfully compete with all the emerging competition in the payment space, because this is really a market that's exploding. So there are plenty of opportunities with open banking and how PayPal can potentially leverage from it. And we're now going to be working with them to make sure that they use different aspects of open banking within their own product solutions.
All right. Cool. Well, congratulations. It's really nice that you can extend your collaboration there. Yeah, so it's cool. And maybe just to pick up on one other thing that you just mentioned around, so let's say the 4,500 banks that are still active in Europe. I think there's already quite some talks, also even from the regulators, to talk about consolidation at that level. And that's probably also what enhanced competition might bring, because indeed sort of the tiny barriers between all these little regions where they might be active, if they will fade away, there will be a bigger chance that some larger winners will take over the market.
Yeah.
But the same might actually also happen for fintech, of course. We saw that Oak North already announced as well this week that they expect a big shortage for capital for fintech companies. As of course, let's say the VCs are all basically very much looking at their current portfolio rather than making a lot of new investments, given the market distress. But we see, of course, there are quite some fintechs out there. They're kind of hooked on fundraising, and if that might put them in a quite a challenging position. What's your view on that?
I think it really depends on their burn rate. So if they've hired a lot of talent, and they've made a promise, a commitment for business development, and if that comes to stall under the current conditions, then they're of course in a lot of trouble. But luckily, and I think I'm not the only one saying this, is that although there are going to be incredible turbulent times ahead of us, what we are seeing across the board is an acceleration of digital finance, of the digitalization of the financial services industry, and I think fintechs that have a valuable offering that will help financial institutions in either sort of taking their solutions to market through omni-channel or digital channels, or to help them reduce savings by accelerating onboarding time, by improving KYC, by enabling digital identity. These types of applications in the regtech or in the fintech space. I think they'll continue to have a good opportunity in making sure that they generate that demand for their solutions. I also saw that this could be an article this week, that this could be a good opportunity for larger financial institutions to pursue mergers and acquisitions of fintechs, to make sure that they sort of take those third-party players into their own sort of portfolio. But I haven't really seen this actively in the market so far. So I'm actually really looking forward to seeing how this will further evolve.
Yeah. I think there too, I think you definitely see quite a pressure on tech companies in general, but fintech seems to be doing quite well actually, especially all the enabling technologies. Just like Tink, I think there's a very high demand on everyone who supports incumbent industry to further digitize. Because of course also now during the corona measures, everyone has realized that they might not have been so digital as they thought they were, and really need to accelerate their further process. And for the rest, of course, everything with compliance related, like RegTech, is really in demand as well. And I think especially the younger companies that didn't have a very strong revenue base yet, and therefore might have been more lenient on venture capital, that's I think where the challenges mostly are. So I think that's of course would be a worry on our side, that especially the more fragile younger companies are the ones that will be harmed in this situation, and well, could potentially, I think, and it might then be the positive scenario, go up into a larger competitor that is doing well through M&A. But yeah, curious to see how they're going. So maybe you mentioned the market turbulence, right? So I think Corona is really bringing up a lot of challenges in the market. I think fintech's doing fairly well, but we do see, of course, that some industries are really directly impacted, like leisure, tourism. Some will be hampered a bit later.
If I can make a recommendation, so I like to look at different investor presentations from time to time, and if you want to get a sense in terms of what the impact that Corona is currently having and will have over the next couple of years, I recommend looking at the investor deck published by SoftBank. From this quarter. So SoftBank is one of the larger Japanese investors.
Yep.
They make exactly. Yeah. So they make the comparison to the financial crisis from the late 20s, and it's a dire outlook in terms of what we can expect. But looking at the stock market today, and looking at all the capital that's been made available by governments today, we're really seeing the opposite. So there's a really interesting gap between how the market is moving versus what we're seeing, sort of how businesses are responding.
Yeah, it's always a question whether hope or knowledge is actually driving these expectations. It's indeed, it's I can understand a lot of people, especially you see that people are now very slowly beginning to get more outside. Things seem to be getting much more like normal. And I think that gives the impression that things will be like normal. But I think at the same time, you see the unemployment rate going through the roof. And of course, the amount of debt that's being unloaded onto the economy is going to have consequences as well. Either on a company level, where all these companies need to repay a lot of the support that they have got, where they might actually have a lower revenue base to fulfill that. And at the same time, you see, of course, that country balance sheets are also going through the roof, which might trigger another euro crisis potentially, as we also saw some agencies projecting earlier this week. And so it's quite a challenging environment. So I would also definitely say to everyone, please be careful with spending your cash, right? So take good care of your stakeholders, but don't spend everything at the same time. Yeah, curious how that'll go. So So if you look at sort of, I think, and thanks for the tip, I think it's definitely good to look at SoftBank's proposal, let's say investment sheet. They generally have quite a crazy idea on where to invest, but I think they do a lot of research in where market might be heading. So definitely an interesting one to look into. Yes, what else do you think is interesting? I think if we, you probably have some other things on your sleeve as well. So.
Yeah. So I mean, as the research director, I get to, I'm in a really fortunate position that I get to look at the market. I get to do some surveys and studies. And actually, I just Wednesday I did a webinar on the investments and the returns of open banking. So last week I published a report, I published a white paper where we found that the median investment for open banking is 50 to 100 million euros today for financial institutions across Europe, and 45% of organizations spending over 45 million, which is a jaw-dropping amount. You know, it's an astonishing large amount, and you know we have to bear in mind that some of this data was collected pre-corona. But when I validated this data by conducting several interviews with executive board members at some of Europe's largest banks, what they explained to me is that, I mean, two things. One, this budget is really spread across the organization. To them, open banking is part of the digital transformation journey. So it's not one budget, it's actually part of a much broader business transformation roadmap. And second, now that Corona has entered sort of, let's say entered Europe, what they're seeing is rather than sort of changing budgets, they're changing sort of, let's say, the roadmap and priorities in terms of which use cases to deploy. And that's because they anticipate changing customer demands. And just going back to that funding that's been made available by governments, I think the EU has made 750 billion euros available for bank-to-bank lending. They've made 3 trillion euros available for quantitative easing to buy up state, exactly, public bonds, state bonds. It's a lot of capital is being pushed into the market. Now, financial institutions need to make sure that they make this capital available to the businesses and individuals that need it. And we're now seeing, like, through these discussions with executives, they said, yeah, we're going to be using some of that budget, open banking budget, to make sure that we enable this, that indeed the individuals and the businesses are able to verify the income, that they can prove that they have that they used to have recurring income, and that they're a credible partner, and that they are eligible for a loan or eligible for credits in order to bridge the turbulent times that are ahead of us. So it's some really interesting research that has come out, and I think it really shows that whether the economic conditions or whether the Corona situation further impacts the market or not, one thing is clear, the industry is moving to digital finance, and open banking is going to be a central part of that.
Yeah. No, cool. I think we'll definitely make sure that this research is available through our website. So please, everyone, check it out on hollandfintech.com. And I think we could also there maybe make a reference to the paper by SoftBank as well, as you referred to. I think it's definitely a nice piece to look into. But unfortunately, we also have to wrap it up already due to time. We're already out. I think it's really been great to talk to you, Jan. It's really insightful to see. It's really nice because you've got so much time to study the market from across the world. I think you've got a really nice insights. So thanks for sharing those with our audience. Really looking forward to talk again soon to see where the market is heading from an open banking perspective, and of course how Tink is doing, because I think you're doing a great job. So thanks
Fantastic.
again for joining.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. We're looking forward to see you again at least next week. Find the news that we discussed in our newsletter that you can subscribe to at hollandfintech.com, and we're looking forward to see you at another Flash Friday next week. Have a great day.
Okay, I think it's just us now.
Okay, super. It says it's still record. Okay, yeah, not anymore.
Oh, just on Zoom. Sorry, I'll stop on Zoom. There we go.
Okay. All right.
Did you tune out the live streams?
Yeah, it was kind of difficult. YouTube was okay, but LinkedIn was. They said it was a bad. I don't know what happened with it.
It didn't work?
No.
Okay. But YouTube did? No.
Yeah.
Okay.